Welcome to a deep dive into quite a stack of sources we've gathered, articles, research, some really fascinating notes, actually.
Yeah, and they all focus on this corner of the American West that, well, it often gets overlooked. Western Box, Elder County, Utah.
Right, way out there, the far northwestern reaches of the state.
And it's a place defined by its incredible isolation. The geography is just challenging. Think vast stretches of mountains, deserts, scattered valleys.
Settlements like Gross Creek, Lucin, Park Valley.
Snowville, too. And they were separated by these immense distances. Just getting between them was tough in the, late 19th, early 20th centuries.
Let alone getting formal law enforcement there quickly.
Exactly. It was a real hike.
It really sets a unique stage.
Yeah.
So, okay, our mission with these sources is to kind of cut through the facts, maybe a little bit of the folklore, too.
And uncover the different kinds of, crime stories that came out of this landscape.
Yeah, what can they tell us and tell you listening about the people who lived there, the conflicts they faced, and how something like justice actually functioned way out on the edge?
Well, it's a picture shaped hugely by that isolation. Communities weren't dense. They were scattered, mostly centered around farming, ranching, and then later the railroad came through.
Right.
And that remoteness, it definitely bred self-reliance. If trouble showed up, official help wasn't just around the corner, not even close.
Which is a pretty important counterpoint, isn't it, to that romanticized Wild West we always see in movies.
Oh, absolutely.
Our sources seem to suggest the day-to-day reality here was probably, well, less about Hollywood shootouts.
Just less, yeah.
And more about these persistent, almost mundane conflicts that could still seriously, threaten a community's stability.
Exactly. I mean, think about the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office. They were based all the way back in Brigham City,
Miles away.
trying to police hundreds, maybe thousands of square miles of really difficult terrain. With the limited communication they had back then, it was an almost impossible logistical challenge.
So while they definitely dealt with issues we'd recognize today, property crimes, fraud, death investigations,
Sure, but the basics.
getting that official response way out west was a completely different ballgame.
And in a ranching area like that, one type of crime was particularly critical: livestock theft.
Oh, yeah.
Your wealth, your whole livelihood basically walked around on four legs. Protecting that was absolutely paramount and incredibly difficult across all that open range.
So that distance, that lack of immediate official presence, is that why the sources mention things like forming posses? It sounds like citizens really had to take matters into their own hands sometimes.
Precisely. Posses were, well, they were a necessary frontier tool when the official arm of the law just couldn't project itself across that vast landscape quickly enough.
Which was often.
Right. It often fell to citizens, maybe organized under some local authority figure, to pursue criminals. It really highlights that reliance on the community itself.
And it wasn't just about facing down potential outlaws coming in from the outside, was it? Our sources point out that a lot of conflicts were internal.
Oh, yeah. Disputes right within the community.
What were people fighting about most often in a place like this? Land.
Land boundaries were certainly sources of tension, yeah. But in an arid region like Western Box Elder County, water rights were absolutely critical.
Makes sense.
The sources actually describe water as a constant irritation, people taking more than their share, diverting streams, being wasteful with it. These weren't minor issues.
No, not at all.
Access to water meant survival. It meant everything.
Right.
And disputes over it could escalate dramatically.
So basic survival resources became these flashpoints for really significant conflict.
Yeah.
Speaking of escalation, our sources also hint at the presence or maybe just the reputation of figures with more regional notoriety filtering into this area.
Well, you can't really talk about the Utah frontier for long without names that loom large, like Butch Cassidy.
He's certainly iconic. His Wild Bunch and that whole outlaw trail network, it stretched all across the West. That famous Castle Gate robbery down in Carbon County,
Yeah.
that was his most notable Utah exploit.
That's the big one, yeah. And look, Western Box Elder County isn't typically named as one of his main hideouts, not like Brown's Hole or Robber's Roost.
Not a primary hub.
No. But its remote location,
Yeah.
especially relative to places like Brown's Hole, it makes it plausible, as a transit area, a place to lie low, pass through. It's tucked away, out of sight.
And here's something I found fascinating in the notes. This idea that local folklore often claimed connections to figures like Cassidy.
Oh, definitely.
Why do communities do that? Why link themselves to these larger-than-life outlaw narratives?
Well, I think it speaks to how people make sense of their own history, right? How they place themselves within those broader narratives of the American West. Claiming a connection, even if it's a bit tenuous or just based on rumor passed down through generations, it links a remote community to the excitement and danger of the Wild West era. It shapes their identity, how they remember their past.
It's powerful how folklore works like that. But there is another figure our sources point to who seems to have a more direct, maybe more documented connection to this specific border region.
Diamond Field Jack Davis.
Right?
Yeah, his story is deeply tied to those violent sheep and cattle range wars that really flared up just across the border on the Idaho-Nevada frontier.
And he's famously linked to the Deep Creek murders in 1896. That was in Cassie County, Idaho. 2 sheep herders killed, and they were reportedly from Utah.
Right. Davis was initially convicted for that. It was a really sensational case at the time. But he was later pardoned when other people confessed.
So what connects him directly to our deep dive into Western Boggs, Elder County? It's not just that it was nearby or the Utah victims.
No, it's more specific. It's a mention in the field notes from that 1985 Grice Creek Cultural Survey we have. When locals were sharing outlaw stories from the past, they explicitly named Sid Paskett and Diamond Field Jack.
Wow. So his reputation, his name, it definitely traveled across that state line. It wasn't just an Idaho story. It was part of the local narrative on the Utah side, too.
Absolutely. That Utah-Idaho-Nevada border, it really wasn't much of a barrier to movement for outlaws or for conflict. It was more of a porous region, kind of an interconnected criminal ecosystem, you could say, where figures like Davis and the violence associated with them could easily spill over. His name just became woven into the local history.
Okay, let's really focus in on Grouse Creek for a bit then, because that cultural survey gives us such a granular look at life there.
Yeah.
What do these outlaw stories and the descriptions of troubles actually look like on the ground?
Well, the survey field notes, they name a few individuals in those outlaw stories. There's Sid Paskett, Diamond Field Jack Davis, of course, and a guy named Bali Miller.
The Sid Paskett mention is particularly intriguing, I thought. He's labeled an outlaw in some notes.
Right.
Yet other local memories recalled him simply as, like, a friend who visited.
Yeah.
What do you make of that discrepancy? It seems odd.
It really highlights the complexity of local memory, doesn't it? And how reputations can be shaped or evolve over time. Was he a genuine outlaw? Did he just associate with them? Or was he just a local figure whose life story got kind of tangled up with the broader narratives of lawlessness?
The sources don't really give us a clear answer.
No, they don't. Which in itself is an important insight into how history is remembered, you know? Bali Miller is also mentioned, though with less detail in our sources, suggesting maybe varying levels of remembered notoriety.
So these outlaw stories from the survey, they aren't just dry facts. They're the community's own way of remembering and making sense of a past that definitely included danger and disorder.
Precisely. And as some analysis of the survey points out, community memory often functions in complex ways. Sometimes it downplays past conflicts or difficulties, maybe to present a more unified front later on.
Right, looking back with rose-tinted glasses sometimes.
Kind of, so we need to consider that lens when we interpret these accounts.
But alongside the outlaw stories, the sources also highlight what the locals specifically called troubles. Now, these weren't just minor annoyances, were they? Like borrowing sugar.
Oh, far from it. These everyday conflicts, as we might call them, were serious matters. They genuinely threatened the social fabric and the economic stability of a small, isolated community like Grouse Creek. Things could fall apart pretty quickly.
And who stepped up to handle these? If the sheriff was literally days away, how were these potentially explosive situations managed?
That's where local figures became absolutely vital. Bishop David H. Toyne, who was the local LDS church leader there from 1895 to 1916, he seems to have been a key figure. His diary, which is mentioned in the sources, talks about him patching up troubles, getting people together to fix disputes. He was essentially the de facto informal mediator, the go-to guy.
What kinds of troubles was he mediating? Was it, just arguments?
No, these were often fundamental conflicts over resources, disputes between specific named individuals over property lines, for sure, and consistently the constant irrigation water.
Back to the water again.
Always the water. People taking more than their fair share, diverting the flow, using it wastefully when everyone depended on every single drop.
And these could truly boil over into widespread community conflict. not just between two families.
Absolutely. There's this memory from David Cook, recorded in the survey, about the big turmoil around 1912 or 1913. It's a powerful example.
What happened?
What started, incredibly, with a horse race, sparked these deep ill feelings. It led to actual fighting, divided the entire valley. And this was compounded by a water shortage at the same time, which led to people literally guarding streams day and night.
Wow. He described it as a civil war, practically. That quote really hits home how impactful these seemingly local disputes could be in an isolated place.
It shows that in that context, everyday conflicts were absolutely not minor. They were significant disruptions, serious threats, and resolving them depended almost entirely on local leaders and community consensus, not on some distant formal system.
And it wasn't just internal disputes creating tension. External pressures could also ignite conflict, like that push by the massive Miller and Lux cattle empire you mentioned.
Yeah, around 1915, they started pushing big time into the Grouse Creek area, driving thousands and thousands of cattle right through town, as one source puts it, basically to show the people there who was boss.
Intimidation tactics.
Pretty much. Then turning those massive herds loose on the open range that the locals relied on for their own small herds.
Which the locals saw, understandably, as destroying our livelihood.
Exactly. It was an existential threat from this huge, powerful outside corporation. Though it's worth noting, this external pressure also spurred the locals into collective action, like forming the Grouse Creek Cattle Association to protect their interests. So threats could also foster unity sometimes.
Okay, shifting away from Grouse Creek specifically, our sources also point to very different kinds of crime stories, if you can call them that. And they highlight the challenge of finding documentation in other parts of the Western County.
Yeah, the Lucin Cutoff disaster in 1904 is a prime, though tragic, example of a different kind of historical crime story. This one wasn't rooted in outlawry or personal conflict, but more in systemic or industrial negligence.
Tell us about that event. It sounds awful.
It happened near Jackson Station out on the Salt Flats, February 19th, 1904. A supply train, and this is the tragedy, it was carrying explosives, collided with a water train.
Oh, no.
The sources attribute it to a combination of things, a defective switch and brake failure on one of the trains.
And the outcome was?
Utterly catastrophic. The dynamite car exploded with immense force. Reports say it was heard up to 15 miles away, left this huge crater. The entire Berg family, the section foreman, his wife, their 3 children, and his brother, they were all killed instantly near that car.
Devastating.
Along with several Greek laborers working nearby, track and telegraph poles were just wiped out for about a quarter mile. Others at the nearby depot, like the station agent's wife who escaped the building, died later from injuries or shock.
Was there an investigation? An inquest?
There was, and the inquest finding is really critical here. It found the tragedy was avoidable.
How so?
Because a fundamental safety rule hadn't been followed. Explosives were supposed to be transported at least 10 cars away from the engine for safety. They weren't. So while it wasn't an intentional act of violence like a murder, that failure to follow a critical safety protocol resulting in such mass casualties and destruction, you can absolutely view that as a form of systemic negligence, a corporate failure with horrific public consequences.
When we try to find specific, maybe more traditional crime stories for other Western settlements mentioned, places like Park Valley, Snowville, or Yost, the sources get much patchier, don't they?
They really do. General history books exist for the county, but they rarely delve into specific criminal incidents in those really remote Western areas.
We looked at digitized newspapers, right? Like the Box Elder News from 1904 to 1926.
Yeah, that covers the period better than some later papers. And while you find things like trial calendar listings or brief notes about, officers find suitcases or something.
Right, small things.
Specific, detailed crime narratives from the far western areas seem pretty scarce, at least in the source summaries we reviewed.
And it's important we stay focused on the historical period we're looking at. Our research notes flagged some more recent murders or things completely unrelated geographically or chronologically, like the Cleveland Torso murders or the Unabomber.
Yeah, those are clearly way outside the scope of this historical deep dive into the late 19th, early 20th century West Box Elder. So the scarcity itself, the lack of documented major crime narratives for some of these areas in our sources, is actually an interesting finding.
What could explain it?
Well, it could be several things. Maybe lower populations meant fewer incidents overall. Maybe less newspaper coverage simply because these places were so remote. Maybe disputes were handled entirely informally, leaving no paper trail at all. or simply that records have been lost over time.
So the patchiness is part of the story.
Exactly. Documenting history in such diffuse, isolated regions is inherently challenging. It's often patchy.
This brings us back then to the formal system of law and its actual reach, its effectiveness out there. We know the Box Elder County Sheriff's Office was the official authority.
Right, based in Brigham City.
But policing this vast western territory from there presented these immense logistical hurdles we talked about.
Hurdles that made those frontier tools, like organizing posses, absolutely essential, especially for extending the law's reach across that difficult landscape, particularly for something time-sensitive like pursuing livestock thieves.
But there was a formal system available, at least on paper. Box Elder County was part of Utah's first judicial district. Court records exist, going back into the late 1800s, for civil cases and probate stuff. Newspapers did report on court activities sometimes.
So the machinery of formal justice, it was technically in place, it existed, but the absolutely critical question for residents of places like Grouse Creek or Lucin or Park Valley is how accessible was that system in reality?
Right.
Traveling all the way to Brigham City for a court date, that was a major, costly undertaking. Days of travel, possibly across rough terrain, depending on the season.
That practical distance, that barrier, it must have created a kind of dual system of justice in practice, didn't it?
It really seems that's a key insight from the sources, yeah.
Yeah.
Major, undeniable crimes, maybe a murder, a big robbery, they might eventually make their way to the formal court system in Brigham City if the perpetrator was
If they were caught, right.
But it's highly likely, just given the challenges, that many, many lesser offenses, property disputes, neighborly arguments, and particularly those community troubles we discussed in Grouse Creek, they were handled informally, right there at the local level.
With figures like Bishop Toyne acting as the primary agents of justice, or maybe more accurately, conflict resolution.
Exactly. That localized, informal approach was quicker, it was cheaper, and it was probably much more attuned to the specific customs and needs and personalities of the isolated community than the distant formal court could ever hope to be.
So the sources really show us that justice on this frontier wasn't one single monolithic system. It took many different forms, reflected both in the official records we can find.
And just as importantly, in the stories and the memories of all the things that were handled outside those official records, the gaps tell a story too.
Okay, so looking across all these different threads, we've pulled the whispers of legendary outlaws like Cassidy, the horrifying outcome of industrial failures like the Lucin disaster, those deeply personal community conflicts, the Troubles. The historical crime stories of Western Box Elder County are surprisingly diverse.
They really are. And whether they're hard documented fact or filtered through generations of folklore, whether they're meticulously recorded in a court file or survive only in oral tradition, these stories absolutely contribute to the region's identity, its collective memory.
They offer a powerful window, don't they, into the challenges and the sheer resilience required to build a life on that frontier edge.
Yeah, and that interplay between fact and folklore is such a recurring theme here. The Cassidy legend shows how communities want to connect themselves to those broader Western narratives. The Grouse Creek outlaw stories seem like a fascinating blend of maybe actual encounters and details that got reshaped or embellished through oral tradition over the years. Even published histories, like books about the outlaw trail, they influence memory too, so we have to look critically at all those layers.
Which is precisely why local memory and oral history, like the stuff captured in that Grouse Creek survey and analyzed by scholars like Thomas Carter, are just so incredibly valuable.
Absolutely essential. They preserve details, perspectives, feelings that simply wouldn't appear in a formal court record or a sheriff's report.
They give us a grassroots understanding from the ground up of what disorder actually looked like and felt like to the people living through it, and how they tried to maintain order themselves.
Yeah, and Carter's analysis, that reminder that memory isn't always a perfect video recording, that it can be shaped, maybe smoothing over past conflict sometimes to emphasize community unity in later tellings. That's crucial context for interpreting all these accounts.
So these aren't just lists of bad things that happened way back when. These stories illuminate how order was attempted, how conflicts were navigated and resolved, maybe sometimes not resolved, and how crime itself was defined and experienced within the very specific, very isolated context of Western Box Elder County.
Yeah, it's a much richer picture than just outlaws and sheriffs.
So we've journeyed through this landscape profoundly shaped by distance, haven't we? And we've discovered historical crime stories that range from those echoes of outlaw legends to a truly tragic industrial disaster, and all the way down to the very real, everyday community troubles.
And I think what we've really learned is the fundamental impact that geography, that sheer isolation had on law and order. How regional notoriety could intersect with very local experience, the vital, often uncredited role of community figures in just maintaining peace day to day, and that crime on the frontier took many, many different forms.
Understanding these stories, hopefully, for you listening, helps appreciate the deep complexities of settling the American West, and how communities, often left largely to their own devices, figured out how to forge some kind of order in really isolated circumstances. It shows us that history isn't just about grand events and official records.
No, it's also about the daily struggles, the personal conflicts, and the local solutions that shaped people's lives.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with, building on all this.
If those formal official records down in Brigham City or Salt Lake City only ever captured a small fraction of the actual conflicts and disputes happening out in those remote western valleys, what does that tell us about where true justice or order really resided on the frontier? Was it in the courthouse, or was it in the community meeting, or maybe somewhere else entirely?
And what other crucial stories, the ones held only in community memory or maybe buried in undiscovered local diaries or letters, might still be out there just waiting to be heard?